A desperate search for a missing Valley woman has turned into a murder investigation.
Glendale police have arrested a man who they say met a woman online, social media, went on a date with her, and then murdered her.
Her keys were still sitting on the kitchen counter. Her dog was locked inside the apartment, alone, like she'd meant to be back in 5 minutes. Her wallet was gone. Her front door had been forced open. And on her phone, the one investigators would later find broken inside her apartment. The video calls to her 2-year-old son had simply stopped. She never came back. A week later, they found her in a shallow grave in the middle of the desert near Lake Pleasant, Arizona. If this is your first time here, welcome to the Homicide Room. Go ahead and subscribe, tap that notification bell so you catch the next case the moment it drops, and let us know in the comments what city or country you're watching from tonight. What happened to Arianna Bailey Jones didn't start in that desert. It started with a first date, and a decision that felt completely ordinary at the time. What nobody knew that week was that the man she was about to meet had already driven out to the place she'd die, hours before he ever picked her up. That single detail, buried in phone data investigators wouldn't uncover for days, is the thing that would eventually break this entire case wide open. Arianna's story doesn't start easy. According to her mother, Sophia Sardinas, Arianna's early childhood was unstable in a way most people never have to think about. She was adopted at 3 years old and moved between homes in the years that followed. The kind of early instability that leaves a quiet, permanent mark on a child. A house that doesn't stay the same house. A routine that keeps resetting. Somewhere to belong that never quite holds still. She carried that with her for years. And then, when she was 18, something happened that reshaped the rest of her life. She and her biological mother, Sophia, found their way back to each other. It wasn't a quiet, distant reconnection. By every account, the two of them built something real out of it. Regular calls, regular visits, the ordinary rituals of a mother and daughter who'd finally been given the chance to actually know each other. Sophia would later describe her love for her daughter in the rawest possible terms, saying simply that she loved her with everything she had, and that none of what happened to her was supposed to happen. By 21, Arianna had built a life for herself in Glendale, a suburb just northwest of Phoenix. She was working toward becoming a professional hairstylist, and according to people close to her, she wasn't just doing a job. She was chasing a dream. Owning her own salon one day, building something with her own name on it, in a way nobody had ever built anything for her. But more than any career, what she wanted most was simple. Family, roots, something permanent. She found the start of that when she had her son. At the time she disappeared, that little boy, just 2 years old, was staying with his grandmother, Sophia. And it was that routine, more than anything else, that told Sophia something had gone terribly wrong days before anyone had proof of it. Arianna had been doing regular video calls with her son while he stayed with his grandmother. Those calls stopped. Her text messages, which had always been marked as read almost instantly, stopped being read at all. She loved her son so much, and that's how I knew that something was wrong, Sophia would later say. She would never just leave and not make sure I was okay with keeping him a little bit longer. Every case like this has one night that, in hindsight, becomes impossible to look at as ordinary again. For Arianna, that night was the 4th of July. While most of the country had their eyes turned toward fireworks, Arianna was staying in. 21 years old and not feeling well, sidelined by a stomach bug that wouldn't ease up. At 5:43 in the evening, she called her mother. It wasn't a long conversation, and it wasn't a heavy one. She told Sophia she'd spent part of the day sick, dealing with an upset stomach from something she'd eaten. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd missed a boat party out at Lake Pleasant the night before. The same lake, as it would turn out, that sat only a short distance from where she'd be found a little over a week later, because she hadn't registered or bought her ticket in time. It was the kind of call you have 100 times with your mom and never think twice about. Small talk. A minor inconvenience. Nothing that leaves an impression at the moment. Except this one did. because it turned out to be the last conversation they would ever have. The following evening, July 5th, Arianna had plans to meet someone for a movie, someone described by a friend simply as an acquaintance. Her family had no reason to be alarmed. People go on dates. People meet friends for movies on a Sunday night. There was nothing about the plan itself that should have worried anybody. By around 5:30 that evening, her family had their last confirmed contact with her. And then, nothing. By July 7th, a relative called the Glendale Police Department and requested a welfare check. When officers and family got into Arianna's apartment, the picture that emerged wasn't chaotic, but it was deeply unsettling. The front door showed signs of damage, forced open, not in some dramatic, movie-style break-in, but enough to make clear that someone had come or gone in a way that wasn't normal. Inside, her keys were sitting on the counter, the kind of detail investigators pay close attention to, because people typically don't leave their keys behind unless they expect to be right back. A cell phone was found broken inside the apartment. Her wallet was missing entirely. Her dog was in its kennel. It had been there for days, without food or water. For a woman, friends and family describe as endlessly devoted to her son, to the people around her, to the small animal she'd chosen to take care of. This alone told everyone in that apartment that something had gone very wrong. She would not have left her dog like that, not by choice. Investigators pulled cell records and found that her phone had gone dark on the evening of Sunday, July 5th, after pinging off a tower near a remote area well outside the city. After that, nothing. No further location data. Just silence. In the last place on Earth, a phone should go silent if everything is fine. Arianna's family didn't need an official report to know something had gone badly wrong. They'd already felt it. Before we go further into how investigators piece this together, take a second and hit subscribe if you haven't yet. This channel exists because people like you keep coming back for cases exactly like this one. As investigators mapped out Arianna's final hours, one detail stood out. She had plans for the evening of July 5th, the same day her phone went silent, to meet someone for a movie. Not a longtime boyfriend. Not anyone from her regular circle. Someone she'd connected with through Snapchat and had never actually stood in front of, face to face, until that night. It's worth pausing on that, because it's one of those details that shows up in so many cases like this one, and it's the kind of ordinary decision that becomes unbearable to look back on. Meeting someone from the internet for a first date isn't reckless. It's simply how a huge share of people her age meet each other now. Arianna had no way of knowing this particular decision, on this particular night, would be different. Detectives pulled phone records, surveillance footage, and message histories, and all of it led them to the same name, 24-year-old demonic Scott Glenn Rodolico of Peoria, someone Arianna had been talking to through Snapchat. That night was set to be the first time the two of them actually met in person. Surveillance footage backed up what investigators were finding in the digital trail. That evening, Rodolico picked Arianna up, and cameras placed the two of them heading toward a Harkins Theater in North Phoenix, near Interstate 17 and Happy Valley Road. From the outside, everything about it looked completely normal. A movie. The kind of low-stakes first date that happens thousands of times a week and almost never ends up on the news. Rodolico was later seen on theater surveillance footage leaving with a concession stand cup in hand, a small, forgettable detail at the time that would later become one more thread tying him to a location investigators needed to place him. The movie ended. They didn't go home. Cell tower data and vehicle tracking placed both of their phones out in a remote stretch of desert near Lake Pleasant, the exact area where Arianna's phone would go dark for the last time. And this is where the investigation took the turn that changed everything. When detectives pulled Rodolico's phone records more closely, they found something that, on its own, would have seemed almost too specific to be a coincidence. His phone showed he had been to that exact remote location multiple times that same day, including, critically, before he ever picked Arianna up for their date. Read that again, because it's the hinge the entire case turns on. Before the movie even started, before a single ticket was bought, he had already been out there, more than once. For investigators, This wasn't a small red flag. It was the detail that turned a missing persons case into something far more serious, far faster than anyone wants it to. People don't typically make repeated, unexplained trips to a remote desert location on the same day they're taking someone on a first date without a reason. And whatever that reason was, it existed before Arianna ever got in his car. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of case we dig into. Not just the crime, but the investigation behind it. Subscribe now so you catch the next one the moment it drops. Nearly a week after that welfare check confirmed she was missing, cadaver dogs led investigators to a shallow grave in that same remote area near the lake. Human remains were recovered from the scene. Clothing and other physical evidence at the site matched Arianna, allowing detectives to move forward with identification, even as the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office continued working to make it official. Near the burial site, investigators recovered a small but significant piece of physical evidence, a drink cup from the same theater the two of them had visited only hours earlier. In a case built heavily on circumstantial and digital evidence, one concrete item physically tying a suspect's movements to the burial site carries enormous weight. That same day, police moved to make an arrest. He hadn't run. When officers found him, he was in the middle of cleaning out the interior of his car. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it's one of the details that tends to stick with people longest in cases like this. Not a dramatic manhunt, not someone fleeing across state lines, just someone going about an ordinary task, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that the walls were already closing in around him. Officers noted a fresh injury to his hand. During their search, investigators also recovered digging tools and vehicle cleaning supplies, items that, taken individually, wouldn't raise a single flag. Most people own a shovel somewhere in a garage. Most people clean their cars. But layered on top of everything else, the repeated trips to that same patch of desert before the date even began, the timeline placing him with Arianna in her final hours, the physical evidence tying the scene back to him. It read to investigators as an attempt to erase a trail, not the aftermath of an accident. Rodolico was arrested and charged with first-degree, premeditated murder, along with a charge of abandonment or concealment of a dead body. He was held on a $2 million cash bond. We'll get into exactly what that figure means a little later. And this wasn't his first encounter with the legal system. At the time of his arrest, Rodolico was already on probation, stemming from a prior conviction for criminal impersonation and theft. The result of posing as an employee at 2 different Valley convenience stores months earlier to walk out with cash from the register. He'd been sentenced only months before this case began and classified at the time as non-dangerous. Here's where this case takes a turn that feels almost too on the nose for a true crime story, except it's real, and it's documented in a probable cause affidavit later obtained by reporters. When detectives sat Rodolico down, he didn't deny being with Arianna that night. He couldn't. The evidence already had him there, time-stamped and geolocated at every step. Instead, he offered an explanation. He told investigators that he and Arianna had been jumped out in the desert by 2 unknown men who allegedly attacked and stabbed her while he escaped. It's the kind of story that sounds plausible for about 4 seconds until you ask the obvious questions. If 2 men attacked you and stabbed your date, why didn't you call 911? Why didn't you flag down a single person on your way out of that desert? Why, in the days that followed, with Arianna's family desperately searching and police publicly appealing for information, did he never once come forward on his own? He never made that call, not to police, not to anyone. As Glendale police spokesperson Jose Santiago put it at a press conference, he never reported the incident to us. He never made a call to police or to anyone to let anyone know about this attack. And the story didn't stay still. Every time detectives pushed for details, the account shifted. His story continuously changed, Santiago said. The attack became a little bit more dramatic, less dramatic. At one point, Rodolico reportedly told investigators that Arianna was probably not alive after the alleged attack. A strange, clinical thing to say about someone you supposedly just watched get stabbed by strangers and then simply left behind. Eventually, according to the affidavit, Rodolico admitted his story about the two attackers wasn't true. He'd been lying in a version of events that collapsed the moment it was tested against the physical world outside his own account. We're going to get into exactly what investigators believe really happened out there. But first, if this case has your attention, do us a favor and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like Arianna's the right way. The phrase investigators used, the one that ended up in headlines across the country, was well planned. Not a date gone wrong. Not an argument that spiraled out of control. A plan. The evidence supporting that word choice went beyond the 2 desert trips we already covered. Detectives also determined Rodolico had purchased supplies later used to bury Arianna's body, and that those supplies were bought before the 2 of them ever sat down inside that movie theater. In other words, the burial site wasn't just scouted in advance. The materials to conceal a body had already been acquired before the date had even properly begun. A confirmed motive has never been publicly released. There's no indication that Arianna and Rodolico had any prior relationship, conflict, or history beyond their online conversations and this single date, which, in some ways, makes the premeditation harder to sit with. This wasn't the tragic escalation of an existing conflict. Based on everything investigators have laid out, this looks like a stranger who used a first date as the delivery mechanism for a plan already set in motion, for reasons that remain locked inside his own account of that night. Chapter 10, Foyer Dies. It's worth slowing down here, because how fast this case came together says something important about where criminal investigations are headed. Glendale Police Department's Special Investigations Unit didn't have months. They didn't even have weeks. Working alongside the U.S. Marshals Task Force, they pieced this entire case together in 4 days, according to Santiago. Cell phone data placed Rodolico's device and Arianna's, moving together from her apartment to the theater and then north into the desert. Automated license plate reader technology, the kind of camera network quietly logging vehicles at intersections across the valley, helped investigators trace his car along that same route and confirmed he'd made the trip to that desert location twice on July 5th, with the earlier trip happening before he ever picked Arianna up. "We were able to pinpoint him attending her apartment," Santiago told reporters. "We were able to pinpoint him attending these different areas, going to the movies. We were able to pinpoint their cell phone usage in different areas. There was no single smoking gun in this case. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of digital breadcrumbs, surveillance footage confirming the theater, cell data confirming the desert, historical location data confirming Rodolico had been out there before Arianna was ever involved, cross-referenced against each other until they formed a timeline nobody could argue with. It's a chilling thing to consider. How much of our daily lives are logged passively, invisibly, all the time, waiting to be assembled into a story only after something has gone terribly wrong. By the time detectives moved on Rodolico, they weren't guessing. They were closing a circle that had already been drawn. Throughout the investigation and everything that followed, Sophia Sardinas became one of the most visible voices connected to this case, speaking to local news outlets as the search for her daughter unfolded and continuing to speak out after. She's described, in raw and unfiltered terms, the fear she felt walking into her daughter's apartment for the first time after that welfare check. A feeling she couldn't explain, but couldn't shake either, long before there was any official confirmation of what had happened. She didn't deserve to be in a grave like that, Sophia said. She's spoken about the plans her daughter had for her future. She wanted to have a family. That's all she wanted, she said. And for this guy to take her life from her like that? She's also spoken with total clarity about the injustice of it. It's not fair. It's not fair at all, she said. To her, to me, to her son, to her brothers and her sisters. It's not fair to anybody. To her friends. She was 21 years old, 21. At the time Arianna disappeared, Sophia was watching her grandson. She said she believes her daughter fought to get back to him. That whatever happened out in that desert Arianna would not have simply let it happen without a fight, not with a 2-year-old son waiting for her at home. A fundraiser was organized to help the family cover funeral expenses and support Arianna's son going forward. In the days before her body was found, Sophia was out distributing flyers herself, holding on to hope even as each day made that hope harder to sustain. If stories like Arianna's matter to you, not just the crime, but the person underneath it, subscribing to this channel is the easiest way to make sure you catch how we cover them. It costs nothing, and it tells us to keep doing this the right way. Arianna's disappearance and death drew attention well beyond her immediate circle. Advocates on social media amplified the search while she was still missing, and continued raising her name after her body was found, using her case to spotlight a broader conversation about how quickly, or how slowly, systems respond when young women, particularly women of color, go missing. Sophia had reportedly requested a turquoise alert, Arizona's statewide notification system for missing and endangered persons, established in memory of Emily Pike, a teenager whose own unsolved case exposed serious gaps in how these alerts function across the state. Whether or not that specific alert was activated in time, the request itself speaks to how urgently Arianna's family understood something was deeply wrong, well before police confirmed the worst. Local television coverage played a real role in keeping this case visible throughout. Reporters spoke directly with Sophia and with people who knew Arianna, giving the public a fuller picture of who she was beyond the details of the crime. That kind of sustained coverage kept public pressure on the investigation and ensured her story reached far beyond Glendale, at a time when every extra set of eyes looking for her mattered. It's impossible to tell this story without addressing the broader question it raises. Meeting someone online before ever meeting them in person is, for an entire generation, simply how dating works now. It isn't reckless. It isn't naive. It's the default. And for the overwhelming majority of people who do it, it leads to nothing more dramatic than an awkward dinner or, occasionally, something real and lasting. But cases like Arianna's are a reminder of a risk that's easy to forget precisely because it's so rare. When you meet someone for the first time whose only footprint in your life is a handful of messages, you're trusting someone you have no independent way of verifying, no mutual friend to vouch for them, no shared history to draw from, just a conversation and a decision to meet. Safety advocates consistently recommend a handful of precautions for first meetings arranged online: meeting in public, well-lit locations, sharing your location with a trusted friend or family member in real time, arranging your own transportation, and having a check-in plan with a specific time to confirm you're safe. None of these guarantee safety. They can't stop someone who has already decided, before the date even begins, what they intend to do. But they create friction and visibility, the kind that makes it harder for something to go wrong without anyone noticing until it's too late. From everything investigators and Arianna's family have described, this was a normal first date, right up until the point it wasn't. That's precisely what makes this case so difficult to sit with, and precisely why it's worth talking about honestly. Not as proof that Arianna did anything wrong, but because understanding how these situations unfold is part of how the rest of us get a little better at protecting the people we love. As of early August 2026, a Maricopa County grand jury formally indicted Rodolico on the murder charges. He's scheduled to stand trial in March. He has pleaded not guilty, and under the law, he is presumed innocent until and unless a jury finds otherwise. A presumption this channel takes seriously, because the courtroom, not a comment section, is where guilt or innocence actually gets decided. Between now and then, expect pretrial hearings, likely motions from the defense challenging aspects of the digital evidence, and continued forensic work as the medical examiner's office finalizes its findings on cause of death. Cases built heavily on cell tower data, license plate reads, and surveillance footage, rather than a confession or a direct eyewitness, often move slowly through the courts, since every piece of that evidence has to be properly authenticated before a jury ever sees it. It's not uncommon for cases like this to take well over a year to reach trial. For Sophia, that means the fight for accountability is far from over. She's already made clear she intends to be present for every single hearing, however long the process takes. Perhaps the hardest part of this case to sit with isn't the crime itself, but what it leaves behind. Arianna's son was 2 years old when she died. Too young to remember the sound of her voice. Too young to hold on to specific memories the way an older child might. What he'll have instead is what his family gives him. Stories. Photographs. The accounts of everyone who knew his mother and is determined to keep her present in his life, even in her absence. Sophia has spoken about her intention to make sure of exactly that her grandson grows up understanding not just what happened to his mother, but the specific, particular ways she loved him, and the future she'd been building for both of them. That's the part of this story that outlasts the headlines. A young woman who spent her own childhood searching for the kind of steady, permanent home other people take for granted, and who, by 21, had rebuilt a relationship with her mother, was building toward a career she was proud of, and had become the devoted parent she'd always wanted for herself. It's worth explaining, in plain terms, how a case like this gets built entirely around location data, because it's become one of the single most important tools in modern homicide investigations, and it's exactly what cracked this one open. Every time a smartphone communicates with a nearby cell tower, it leaves a record. That record includes an approximate location and a timestamp. On its own, a single ping doesn't tell investigators much, but stitched together across hours, in this case, across an entire day, those pings create a route, a movement pattern that can place a person, or at least their phone, in a specific area at a specific time. That's how investigators established that Rodoliko's phone had made multiple trips to the remote desert location where Arianna's body was eventually found, and, critically, that some of those trips happened before he ever picked her up that evening. It's also how they confirmed her own phone went dark in that exact same location and never activated again. Paired with surveillance footage from the theater and the surrounding area, investigators were able to build a nearly minute-by-minute account of the evening, without a single eyewitness to the crime itself. This is increasingly how contemporary homicide cases get solved. Not through confessions or witnesses, but through the quiet, constant trail of data nearly everyone carries in their pocket without a second thought. In trying to reconstruct Arianna's final hours, investigators didn't need her to have told anyone where she was going. Her phone had already been telling that story the entire time. None of this work happens quickly, and none of it happens with the certainty true crime coverage sometimes implies. Digital forensics teams don't receive a neat printout with a route already mapped out. They receive raw data, thousands of individual entries, tower identifiers, signal readings that have to be manually cross-referenced against known tower locations to reconstruct even a rough approximation of where a phone had been. Surveillance footage requires its own painstaking process too, since investigators have to identify, request, and review footage from multiple sources, then synchronize timestamps across systems that don't always log time the same way. It's slow, deliberate work. What made this case solvable, according to those close to the investigation, wasn't a single breakthrough moment. It was the accumulation of many smaller ones, layered carefully on top of each other, until they formed a case strong enough to support a first-degree murder charge. It's natural, in a case like this, to want to understand who demonic Rodoliko actually was before any of this. Not to excuse anything, but because there's a particular kind of dread that comes with realizing someone capable of this kind of calculated violence was, up until that point, just another 24-year-old moving through daily life, going to work, scrolling social media, messaging people online like anyone else. What the public record shows paints a picture of someone with an established pattern of dishonesty well before this case. The convenience store thefts he was convicted of weren't crimes of desperation carried out in a moment of panic. They involved impersonation, walking into a business, presenting himself as someone he wasn't, and using that false identity to access money that wasn't his. It's a specific kind of criminal behavior that requires a level of comfort with deception, with performing a role convincingly enough that the people around him didn't question it. That same comfort with deception shows up again in how Rodolico allegedly handled himself after Arianna's death, constructing an elaborate story about two attackers, adjusting the details each time investigators pushed back, and maintaining that story for days while her family searched desperately and police worked the case in public. It takes a particular kind of composure to sit across from detectives, knowing what you know, and continue building out a fictional account in real time. None of this amounts to a diagnosis, and it isn't this channel's place to speculate about what was happening internally for Rodolico in the lead up to July 5th. What the evidence does suggest, according to investigators, is intent formed well in advance. Not a switch that flipped in the desert that night, but a plan that had already been drafted, resourced, and rehearsed before Arianna ever got in his car. At the time of his conviction for the convenience store thefts, court paperwork had listed him as non-dangerous. Less than a year later, he was facing the most serious charge that exists under Arizona law. There's a particular kind of hope families hold on to once an arrest is made, and it's worth naming honestly. A conviction, if it comes, will not undo what happened in that desert on July 5th. It won't return Arianna to her son, or to her mother, or to the friends who are still learning to talk about her in the past tense. What a trial can offer is something narrower and still important. A formal, public accounting of what happened, tested under oath, cross-examined by a defense attorney whose job is to poke every hole possible in the state's case, and ultimately decided by 12 people who owe Arianna nothing except a fair and careful look at the evidence. That process matters, even when it's slow, even when it stretches out over the better part of a year before a jury is ever seated. Cases built primarily on circumstantial and digital evidence, rather than a confession or direct eyewitness testimony, can move especially slowly through the courts. Every piece of location data, every surveillance clip, has to be properly authenticated and entered before it means anything to a jury. For Sophia Sardinas, and for everyone who loved Arianna, that scaffolding probably feels unbearably slow. It usually does. The 4 days it took investigators to identify and arrest a suspect stand in sharp contrast to the many months it will likely take to bring this case to trial and, eventually, to a verdict. That gap between how fast an investigation can move with the right technology and evidence and how deliberately the court system is required to move afterward is one of the more frustrating realities of the justice process for families living through it. It's also, by design, part of what protects the presumption of innocence that every defendant, including Rodolico, is entitled to under the law. Subscribe to the Homicide Room if you want to see how this one plays out in the courtroom next spring. We'll be following it closely, hearing by hearing, all the way to a verdict. The size of a bail amount rarely gets much attention in coverage of a case like this, but it's worth understanding what it actually signals. A $2 million cash bond is exceptionally high, reserved for cases where a judge has determined there's both a serious risk to public safety and a meaningful risk of flight if the accused were released. In practice, a bond set at this level functions as a form of pretrial detention for almost anyone who doesn't have significant financial resources. Very few defendants are able to post $2 million in cash, which means Rodolico has remained in custody throughout the entirety of the pretrial process, unable to return to any semblance of normal life while the investigation and court proceedings continue. Judges weigh a range of factors in setting bond amounts this high. The severity of the charge, the strength of the evidence presented at the initial hearing, any prior criminal history, and whether the accused is seen as a danger to the broader community if released. In this case, the combination of a first-degree murder charge, an existing probation status, and evidence suggesting a pattern of behavior before the crime occurred all likely factored into the decision to set bond at a level functionally guaranteeing continued detention. For Arianna's family, this detail offers a small measure of reassurance amid an otherwise agonizing process. The knowledge that, whatever happens as the case moves toward trial, the man charged with her murder will not be walking free in the meantime. Chapter 20. WHY Cases Like This Matter. It would be easy to file this case away as simply another cautionary tale about the risks of online dating, and move on. But that framing misses something important, and it's worth naming directly before we close this one out. Arianna didn't do anything unusual. She didn't take an outsized risk. She made the same basic decision an enormous number of people make every week without incident. She agreed to meet someone in a public place for a completely ordinary first date. The tragedy of this case isn't that she was careless. It's that, in the overwhelming majority of cases like hers, nothing goes wrong at all. And the rare cases where something does are precisely what makes stories like this one worth telling carefully, rather than sensationally. Cases like this matter because they push investigators to get better at exactly the kind of digital forensic work that ultimately identified a suspect here. The cell tower analysis, the surveillance cross-referencing, the painstaking reconstruction of a timeline with no direct witnesses. Every case solved using these methods adds to a growing body of investigative practice that makes the next case, and the one after that, a little easier to crack. They matter, too, because of what they leave behind in the families forced to live through them. Sophia didn't ask to become a public advocate for her daughter's case. She became one anyway, because someone has to keep a case like this from fading out of public attention during the long, slow grind of the legal process still ahead. And they matter because of the people at the center of them. Not as case numbers or cautionary examples, but as people who had entire lives, plans, and relationships that mattered enormously to everyone around them, right up until the moment all of it was cut short. One of the unsettling truths about cases like this is how ordinary everything looks from the outside while it's happening. Arianna's apartment complex was the kind of place you'd find in any mid-sized Arizona suburb. A handful of buildings, a shared parking lot, neighbors who wave in passing but don't necessarily know each other's names. Nobody there reported hearing anything unusual on the night her door was forced open, or in the days that followed. No shouting, no struggle, nothing that would have prompted a call to police on its own. That's not unusual, and it isn't a failure on anyone's part. It's simply how most of these cases unfold. The violence itself, when it happens, is rarely the loud, visible event true crime dramatizations sometimes make it out to be. It's the absence afterward, the silence, the unanswered video calls, the dog left without food, that eventually draws attention, and by then, days have already passed. For investigators, this means the earliest and most valuable evidence in a case like this often isn't found at the scene of the disappearance at all. It's found in data, phone records, tower pings, surveillance footage from businesses miles away. The digital trail becomes the eyewitness the physical world failed to provide. Without a single human witness to what happened between the theater and that stretch of desert, investigators had to reconstruct the entire sequence using nothing else. And it was that reconstruction, more than any single confession or piece of physical evidence, that ultimately built the case against the man Arianna had gone on a date with. Even with an arrest made and charges filed, there remain significant gaps in the public record of this case. Gaps investigators have been deliberately careful not to fill prematurely. Chief among them is motive. Despite building a case substantial enough to bring first-degree, premeditated murder charges, authorities have not offered any public explanation for why. Was this a plan formed after a single online conversation? Did something happen earlier that day, during those repeated visits to the desert location, that set events into motion before Arianna was ever involved? Investigators haven't said, and it's likely they won't until the case reaches trial, if even then. Cause of death has also not been publicly disclosed. This is common practice in active homicide investigations. Withholding certain details, particularly around cause of death, helps investigators distinguish a credible tip or confession from someone simply repeating what they've read in the news. It's a small but important safeguard in a case that will eventually depend heavily on the integrity of the evidence presented in court. Investigators have also been notably quiet about the full nature of the relationship between Arianna and Rodolico. Specifically, how long the two of them had actually been in contact online before that night, and whether there was any prior interaction beyond what's been publicly described as their first in-person meeting. That detail could matter enormously for establishing premeditation, and it's likely part of what prosecutors are still building out ahead of trial. For now, what the public has is a timeline, a piece of physical evidence tying Rodolico to the burial site, and a contradiction between his account and the data recovered from his own phone. Everything else, the why, the how long, the what really happened out there, remains locked behind an investigation that, as of this reporting, is still very much active. Clossing. What happened to Arianna Bailey Jones is the kind of story that sits with you precisely because there's nothing unusual about how it started. A first date. Someone met online. A movie on a Sunday night. Millions of people make that exact same decision every single week, and for almost all of them, nothing goes wrong. For Arianna, it did. And the detail that still doesn't sit right, the one piece of this case that remains genuinely hard to explain away, is why he was already out at that location, more than once, before their date had even begun. As this case heads toward a trial next spring, one thing is already clear. Arianna was more than the final hours of her life. She was a daughter who fought to find her way back to her mother. A parent who built exactly the kind of steady, loving home for her son that she'd spent her own early years searching for. And she deserved every one of the decades she should have had left. What do you think was really going through his mind that day, hours before their date even began? Let us know your theory in the comments. And if you want to catch every case we cover here at the Homicide Room, make sure you're subscribed, because next week's story might be even harder to believe.